Hey y'all, welcome back to the Sasser House, or welcome if it is your first time. If you clicked on this video, it might be because you want to try to bake homemade bread. This is something that I love to do, and I started doing about a year and a half ago, and I have not bought bread from the grocery store since. It is so much easier than we think it is. I used to be so intimidated with making homemade bread, and we think it's really time consuming, and there are ways that are time consuming, but there's also ways to speed up the process. I'm going to give you a couple options today as to different homemade bread recipes that you can use for whatever fits your schedule best. All of the recipes and measurements will be listed in the caption below this video. The first recipe I'm going to show you is your basic white bread. Now you can make this whole wheat with whatever flour you choose to use, or you can do all-purpose flour. You don't have to have bread flour, you can use whatever flour you have on hand. This recipe also makes 2 full loaves of bread. So what I usually do is make a loaf out of 1/2 of it and use the other half for my hamburger buns. The second recipe I'm going to show you is a rustic no knead bread. Now this one is great for folks who want something easy and don't want to take the time to let the bread rise for a second time or knead it or any of the stuff that goes into making homemade bread. This one turns out delicious, and it is great to have on hand. I always have a couple of these baked up and in the freezer ready to go. Before we get started, I want to share a couple things I have learned to make this as cost effective as possible. Now you can make bread for so cheap, and here's the cool thing, you know exactly what is in it. There's no preservatives or anything that is in our grocery store bread. And I'm sure you've noticed you can buy a loaf of bread at the grocery store, stick it in your pantry, and it will last for weeks. That's what really sold me on homemade bread. Once I tasted it, first of all, the taste is so much better than anything you buy at the store. And second, there's no preservatives, so you'll see that it starts to go bad a whole lot sooner than the stuff you buy at the store, and it makes you realize what's in that bread. So since I've committed to making all my bread homemade, I buy some things in bulk and I save a lot of money that way. So I buy my active dry yeast on Amazon. You can get it online, and I buy it in bulk. And one package, I think I got a 2-pound package of it, filled up this jar completely, plus a little extra as well as this one. And I got this probably 6 months ago. And I bake a lot of bread, so I've used all that's in this jar, but I still have this full jar. I keep these in the refrigerator. It will store for pretty much forever, all right? So I keep these jars in the refrigerator, and I always have my yeast on hand. And another thing I do is buy my flour in bulk. We just go to Sam's or Costco and we get our flour in bulk there. So the first and most important step of making homemade bread is getting your water the right temperature for your yeast to proof. You want your water to be somewhere between 105 to 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Some people test this just by touching it to see if it's warm enough. I like to actually use a thermometer to gauge the temperature, because if it's too hot, then it can kill your yeast and then your bread won't rise. So to start out making the bread, you add your water, sugar, and that active dry yeast to a bowl. You're going to let this sit for about 5 to 10 minutes or until the yeast proofs and it's good and foamy and bubbly, and that means it is alive and ready to make bread. Next, I'm going to add in some oil, and then the rest of the ingredients are so simple. We're just going to add a little bit of salt and then our flour. Bread is so easy to make, and most of us have all the ingredients that we need in our house. I make my homemade bread with my KitchenAid mixer, but I'm going to show you how you can make it if you don't have a KitchenAid mixer at home. It takes a little elbow grease because you got to knead it by hand, but you can absolutely do it without the mixer. If you do have your mixer, make sure that you are doing this with the dough hook attachment so that it's able to knead the bread for you. So what I like to do is just add a couple of cups of flour at a time and get those incorporated little by little. I keep the mixer on low speed, and what we're looking for is for the dough to come together and not stick to the sides of the bowl anymore. And sometimes as you add flour, you think that it's coming together and it's not sticking, but let it keep kneading for a little bit, because as it absorbs more of that flour, it will start to stick again. See, this is one of those examples when you think, okay, it's not sticking to the sides of the bowl anymore, but then as it goes, it starts to stick again. Now this is what you want the dough to look like when you've added enough flour. See, the sides of the bowl are clean and the dough has come together. It's nice and smooth and soft. I do want to warn you when you're adding your flour in, because you may not use the exact amount every single time you make bread. Just add it in little by little towards the end so you don't add too much, because you can't take it away if you add too much. If you're using your KitchenAid mixer, go ahead and continue to let it knead with your dough hook. But if you are doing this by hand, you would have just added all these ingredients into your bowl, stirred them up, and then dumped it out on your counter with a little bit of flour. And then this is how I knead my dough by hand. Takes a little bit more time, but it's always good to know how to do this just in case you don't have access to a mixer. This is how I test to see if my dough has been kneaded enough. It's called the window pane test, and you can see it's stretchy and you can see through it, but it doesn't rip apart. Then I grease a large bowl and I add my dough into that, and then I cover it with a towel. And I let this rise for about an hour until it's doubled in size. Once it's doubled in size, go ahead and punch it down. This is one of the fun parts as well. And put it out onto your counter and get ready to make your loaves or hamburger buns or whatever it is you're making. I give this a couple good kneads, and like I said, this makes 2 loaves of white bread. So if you're gonna just make 2 loaves of bread, then split it in half, and you can put both loaves in their own separate loaf pans, but I'm gonna do 1/2 of these as hamburger buns and the other half as a loaf of white bread. To shape your loaf of bread, you can use a rolling pin or your fingers. There's really no specific way that I have found that makes a difference, but you can roll it out. I usually get it the width of the pan that I'm putting it in, and then this time I just rolled it into a log, and then I've folded the edges down, and then the seam at the bottom I just pinch together and I stick it in the loaf pan. People have all different ways to form a loaf of bread, but to me, this is the easiest way. Now I'm going to take the other half that I had of our dough, and I'm going to go ahead and divide this out for our hamburger buns. If you have a food scale, that is a huge way to make everything uniform and cohesive. I do not have a food scale, so I just eyeball it, and they do not always come out the exact same size, but it doesn't matter to us. It all eats the same. Now this is the way I make my hamburger buns, dinner rolls, or anything like that. I basically take the piece of dough and I flatten it out, and then I fold all the edges of that circle into the center. I flip it over and I put my hand over it and I just roll it on the counter so that it all comes together there at the bottom where the seam is, and it is a perfect little ball. So I continue this process with all the pieces that I have, and then we're going to just set this stuff aside. We're going to cover it again with our kitchen towel and let it rise. Now you want everything to double in size again. So this is the part that really takes a long time when making homemade bread. That's probably tedious to most people when they think about doing it, because you've got to wait and let the bread rise. Now for our rustic bread. Y'all, this one could not be more simple, and it turns out so beautiful when it's baked. I love this bread for so many reasons. One, you can make it up to 3 days in advance. You can make the dough in advance, stick it in your fridge, and leave it there for 3 days before you bake it. Or if you want it quicker, you can leave it out on the counter for about 3 hours. My personal favorite way is to stir this up before I go to bed and then pull it out in the morning after it's risen in the fridge overnight, and then bake it, and I've got homemade bread. So all you need for this one is your water, yeast, sugar, salt, and flour, and that's it. I do all of this by hand because it's much simpler to do it that way, and you're not really looking for a firm, smooth dough on this one. You are looking for something a lot more shaggy and soft. So here's what it looks like after a couple cups of flour. As you can see, the dough is really loose and really soft. I'm going to add a little bit more flour, and I learned a good lesson. I was using some whole wheat flour on this one, and it didn't rise as well as it does when I use my all-purpose flour, but I'll show you how all that turned out at the end. So I stir this up by hand until the dough reaches the consistency that I need. And what you're looking for, like I said, is just a dough that is really soft and kind of shaggy and loose. You don't want it to be wet, but you also don't want it to be completely formed and dry either. After you do that, cover it with a piece of plastic wrap, and you can either let it sit on the counter for 3 hours until it rises, or you can put it in the refrigerator for up to 3 days. Once the dough has risen and proved, you can see it's very loose, you're going to want to flour your counter because that dough is going to be very sticky, and you're going to get that dough out of your bowl and get it onto the counter. My biggest tip for anybody who is wanting to make homemade bread but has a busy schedule, or who's wanting to just make more homemade, home-cooked food in general, it saves so much money. We save so much money by just eating at home, but I understand that there are some nights where you just don't feel like cooking. So my biggest tip is when you have the time to meal prep and plan ahead, do it. If you're going to make a loaf of bread, don't just make one loaf of bread. Go ahead and make 2 or 3 loaves of bread so that your freezer is stocked for those times when you just don't feel like cooking. The way I shape this dough is a lot like the rolls, but a whole lot simpler. You just pull all the edges of the dough into the center and then flip it over onto a piece of parchment paper. Now this dough cooks the best in a cast iron or Dutch oven. All right, so I like to put the Dutch oven into my oven while it's preheating to 425 degrees. You can see how hot it gets. And then you just lay that parchment with the dough right into your Dutch oven. You can cook this on a baking sheet as well, but this method really gives your dough the best opportunity to rise because it's got all that steam trapped in there, which helps it rise. So you just put the lid back on and you put it back into your oven to bake. All right, so it is day 2 now because I wanted to show you how I freeze the bread, and I also wanted to make a new loaf of the rustic bread. I used whole wheat flour in the recipe that I did yesterday, and you can see the difference right here. We already cut this because we ate it last night, but you can see the difference. This one did not rise hardly at all with the whole wheat flour, which is very interesting. It's denser than the one with all-purpose flour. This is what it normally looks like and what I'm used to. Now this is still delicious. We ate it last night and we loved it, but I wanted you to know what it normally looks like. And this loaf, I made this last night, just stirred it up, put it in the fridge and let it rise while we slept, and then set it out this morning for about 45 minutes, and then I did the same thing I did yesterday. Put it in the Dutch oven, at 450, and I'll have all the recipes down below, but just listen to it. Oh, that crust. I want to eat it right now. Okay, now back to what I was talking about. Here are my tips on freezing the bread. This is how I've done it for the past 1.5 years. It hasn't let me down. I just wrap it up in some cling wrap, just plastic wrap, and I stick it in the freezer. Now, if I'm not going to eat it, then I like to freeze it on the day that I bake it, day 1 that I bake it. If you don't want to freeze it, since this has no preservatives or anything to add shelf life to the bread, it will go bad a whole lot quicker than what you're used to. Now, if it goes stale, you can always cut it up and make croutons or make breadcrumbs, or you could freeze it on day 2 or 3. But if you're not going to freeze it, you need to try to eat it as quickly as you can. So I wrap it up like this, put it in my freezer, and it stays good for months. And I do the same thing with any rolls or buns that I make as well. Now the rustic bread freezes great as well, so just follow the same steps. Now here's some tips to keep your bread a little bit longer if you're not going to freeze it. I have a bread box in my kitchen, and that is where I store all my bread. If you don't have a bread box, I would really recommend putting your bread in a brown paper bag and just avoiding leaving it next to things that get warm. So like the refrigerator, like next to your refrigerator, on the side of it, on the counter, or next to the stove on the counter. Anything like that is going to speed up the process and maybe cause it to go bad a little bit quicker. Now when you want some bread and it's in the freezer, I've got 2 ways that you can thaw it. Now the first way is what I normally do. If I can think about it in time, then I'll just pull it out of the freezer and I'll put it into the fridge. And it'll be thawed in about, goodness, maybe like 8 hours. Sometimes I'll do this at night before we go to sleep. I'll put the bread from the freezer into the fridge, and the next morning it's ready to go. Or even in the morning, if I think about it, if we need bread for supper, then I'll move it over in the morning, and by that evening it's ready to go. But if you need bread in a hurry, then I've got a tip for that as well. So if you put your frozen bread into the oven at 325, it'll be thawed in about 20 or 30 minutes. And honestly, I love this way of doing it. It comes out of the oven like it was just freshly baked. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Like I said, all of the recipes and instructions are in the caption below. And I hope that it encouraged you to maybe try to make homemade bread for yourself. Seriously, once you have a taste of it, you can't go back. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't yet, and we'll see you on the next one. Bye, y'all.